Hey there! In this video I'm going to talk about color spaces and color pickers. It's an important topic because if you're doing anything digital, you are using those color spaces. Even if you're actually a traditional artist and just do some photo editing to post your artworks. Or when you're printing something out, you're actually converting one color space to another, which can create some unwanted results if you are not careful. And those different color spaces have different pros and cons. It can be hard to decide which one to use, so I want this to be an informative guide for you. I'll do my best to explain all of those things with simple terms and lots of visualizations. To give you a quick overview, this is what we're going to talk about. Firstly, RGB. The standard way for digitally expressing colors and showing them on our screens. And therefore all of our graphics programs are based on this on a fundamental level. Then HSV and HSL, very widely spread types of color pickers that I also normally use. I'll explain the difference between the two and their pros and cons. After that I'll talk about a lesser known but very interesting color space called CIELAB and HCL, which is based on CIELAB. You might not be aware of this, but some graphics programs actually have this too in one form or another. It's useful because it groups colors based on how bright they actually appear to our human eyes. Then CMYK, which is only relevant if you're planning on printing something out. But if you do print something out on an at least semi-professional level, it is very important to understand this one. And last, I'll shortly talk about Pantones. Perhaps you have heard of these before. I want to use this opportunity to clear some things up about those. And by the way, those icons that you just saw will often show up on screen when I say them out loud in this video. All those abbreviations can get confusing real quick. So I want to give you a visual aid to help you distinguish them and hopefully making it easier for you to understand what I'm trying to explain. Now, there are many other color spaces, however, those are basically the most common ones that you can encounter in graphics programs like Photoshop, Clip Studio Paint, GIMP, and so on. But before I talk about any of this, let me explain what color spaces and color pickers actually are. So a color space, as the name suggests, is a space inside of which you have a set of colors grouped in a particular way. A space always has specific coordinates so that you can move to any point within that space. For example, those coordinates could be red, green and blue. Specific amounts of those values will lead you to a specific point within the RGB color space, which is a specific color. You will see that those coordinates can be all sorts of other things, and some of them are easier and more intuitive to navigate than others. Now, a color picker is basically a tool for picking out a color from a color space based on those coordinates. You either have a set of sliders that let you control those coordinates, those variables, or you have one slider and a two-dimensional surface to click on. That surface represents two of those coordinates. Like for example, one slider for changing the hue, and then the horizontal direction of the surface changes the saturation, and the other one the value. I'll get to what those terms mean later in this video. So yeah, a color picker is sort of like a navigator that helps you find your way around in a given color space. These pickers can also come in different shapes. I will later explain the differences between them and which ones I would recommend. Alright, let's take a look at the first color space, RGB. There is quite a lot to say about this one, so buckle up. It is the most relevant color space for digital devices. Generally, I would recommend that to learn how RGB works, at least at a fundamental level. Also because there are lots of color editing tools that are based on the red, green and blue values, and those tools can be immensely useful. Let's get the basics down at first though. RGB is the system for computers to process and show colors. If you take a photo with your camera, the visual information usually gets translated into RGB right away so that your computer can read it. And then your screen shows that picture using RGB too. Every single pixel actually consists of red, green and blue lights. Combining those three colored lights in different amounts creates all the colors you can see on your screens. This is called additive color mixing, because by adding all three colors together, you get white. And if you have none of them, you are left with black, since there is no light at all. Subtractive color mixing, on the other hand, is used with physical paints and inks. You start off with a white surface and make it darker by adding more colors. This will become more relevant later on when we talk about CMYK. Now, the RGB values are usually expressed with numbers between 0 and 255. Why? Well, a computer can only read binary, zeros and ones. A digit that only has two values is called a bit. If you combine 2 bits, you now have 4 combinations in total. 2 times 2. 3 bits is 2 times 2 times 2. So 8 different combinations. If you have 8 bits, then you'll have 256 different values that you can express, which is exactly our red, green and blue values. It's 255 though, because 0 is its own value. So in total, you have 256. You can also express them through a hexadecimal code. In this system, every digit has 16 values now. But since our number system only has 10 different values, we add the letters A to F. And now by combining 2 of those hexadecimal digits, you also get 256 different combinations, because 16 times 16 is 256. So if you see a hashtag and 6 digits, then that is most likely an RGB hex code. The first 2 digits represent the red value, the middle digits green, and the last 2 blue. This is a very convenient way to share colors. Just copy the code, insert it wherever you need it, and you have the exact same color. Okay, how many colors are there then? Well, multiply all 3 maximum values together and you'll get a number larger than 16 million. That sure seems like a lot. However, that amount can actually be still not enough. Usually you don't use the whole spectrum of colors, but only a small set of it. Like for example, let's just look at the gray colors, of which there are also only 256. That's a much smaller amount, and that range can be even more limiting if you mostly use shades of gray that are very close to each other. For example, you have a dark room and one small candle lit in the middle of it. Now we see these rings around the candle. Although we would expect a smooth gradient, there simply aren't enough RGB colors for this purpose. Especially dark scenes have this kind of problem. Now one way to circumvent this is by simply adding more bits. Instead of 8 bits for each RGB value, you could have 10 bits, or 16, or 24. The more bits, the higher the color resolution. If you have 16 bits for example, you suddenly have over 65,000 different shades of gray. And at 24 bits it's over 16 million again. I think certain people would be quite jealous of those amounts of shades. Well, I never actually watched or read that story. I'm just trying to make a dumb joke here. Anyways, so why are we not using those amounts of bits instead then? Well, as the number of possible colors go up, so do the file sizes and the amount of processing power needed. And the majority of our screens only have an 8-bit color depth anyways. And there are some that offer 10 bits, so that's a little bit of an improvement, but you'd have to pay quite a lot more. A more affordable way to get 10 bits is through frame rate control, basically flashing between 2 colors to create the in-between color. And if you want to go up to 12 or more bits, you're likely to encounter prices in the range of thousands of euros. Those are only used for professional color grading. That makes going for higher amounts of bits in your project sound pretty pointless, right? Well, not quite. During editing and drawing, it can actually make sense to use more bits for smoother gradients. They'll later get downsampled to, for example, 8 bits, and the gradients will get smoothened through differing. Take a look at these 2 gradients. They are the same gradients. However, the upper one has been created in an 8-bit project and the lower one in a 32-bit project. Now they look pretty much the same because I'm limited by the video format that I can export and upload on YouTube. I can tell you however that in the original version the lower one looks a whole lot smoother and not as stripy. To explain why, let's zoom in further. Okay, it's a bit hard to see because all those grays are so similar, so let me highlight one specific shade of gray in the middle. This is the key difference here. The gradient at the bottom actually doesn't have more grays, but they are differed, which blends them together to create the illusion of a smooth gradient. And another upside to working with higher bit numbers is that you future-proof your projects, in case that monitors with higher bit depths become more affordable. So in the end, I would actually advise to go for higher amounts of bits when you create a project in your graphics program. Now then, another thing about RGB that you might have to face is that there are actually various types of RGB color spaces. You're probably like, what now? Why make it even more confusing? Yeah, I get you, but there is a reason for that is not too hard to understand. To explain this, let me show you this diagram. This is the so-called CIE 1931XY chromaticity diagram. Now that's a mouthful. And quite a peculiar shape too. So on the outer edge along this arch you actually have all the colors of the rainbow, literally. This is the entire visible light spectrum, so all the pure monochromatic colors that we can see with our eyes. Going from the wavelength that corresponds to red all the way around to violet. The colors in between are created by mixing those colors at the outer edges together. For example, magenta actually is not part of the rainbow, but by mixing red and blue you'll get magenta. White, for example, is also just a mixture of different monochromatic lights. And you can achieve white in basically infinite different ways. Yes, you heard right. Even two pure colors are enough, like for example yellow and blue. You can also use three colors, like red, green and blue, perfectly balanced. Or you mix 100 colors together, also possible. Natural white light that originates from the sun is actually most of the visible wavelengths mixed together. I could keep on going and going. I do love talking about science, but let's not digress too far. We just need to understand the basics of this diagram. The fact that it maps out the colors of the visible light, white, and the mixtures between those. Okay, remember that we're actually talking about RGB? Let's get back to that. Something you can do is map other color spaces on this diagram to see how many colors of the visible spectrum it actually covers. So let's put the RGB color space right on top of it. It is represented as a triangle with the corners at red, green and blue. You probably have noticed it right away, this triangle only covers a small area of the visible color gamut. By the way, the term gamut also appears quite commonly when talking about color spaces. It basically means that it is a specific range of colors within a color space. Imagine a marble cake that you cut into slices. Every slice is going to look different. The gamut is a slice of the cake that is a color space. How large that slice is can vary though. So then, this RGB gamut is called sRGB. The S stands for standard, which is accurate. It is pretty much the RGB gamut used by most devices. And even though it doesn't cover a lot of colors of the visible gamut, it's not that big of a deal either, because the difference between those outer colors is barely perceivable. Well, this diagram is also shown through a video that works in sRGB and shown on your screen that probably is not even capable of showing more than the sRGB range. So you don't see the actual colors that are outside of the sRGB area. You just gotta believe me when I tell you that the difference is not that big. But in case this is not enough and you need that extra range, like in professional settings, wider RGB profiles exist. For example, Adobe RGB. Or ProPhoto RGB, which is so large that it even reaches beyond the visible color gamut. So colors that our eyes cannot see, or that aren't even physically possible. Once again, devices that can actually show those wider RGB ranges are vastly more expensive, and most people don't really need them. So my recommendation would be to just use sRGB, unless you work on some high-end professional stuff. Alright, enough with all of this technical and scientific stuff, let's get more practical. How do you navigate through the RGB space? How do you find the colors that you need? Well, you're basically mixing colors together, and different amounts of each color will create new colors. So, for example, if you want purple, you just mix red and blue together. We get this magenta color if we mix it in equal amounts, so let's make blue more dominant. Okay, let's say we want a brighter purple now, but we already cranked up the blue values to the max, and by increasing red we get more so of a magenta color. Well, we need to increase both red and green now. What we're aiming for is moving towards white. And white has all the RGB values at maximum, so by increasing all three we move closer to white and start to get pastel colors. Okay, how about a dull and rather dark purple this time? So firstly, we need to lower all the values quite significantly to make it darker. And in order to make it dull, so less saturated and closer to a grey color, we need to shift all three colors closer to each other. Not quite the same, otherwise you'll actually get grey. Blue should still be the most dominant color, and red slightly higher than green. There we go. As you can see, it's all about the balance between those three values. Now, would I recommend using this kind of color picker for artists? Honestly, not really. It is doable, you can navigate through this, but it is not really intuitive. Like, let's say I want a teal color that harmonizes well with the dull dark purple that I already have. I may have a rough idea of how to find it, but it would require me fiddling around with the sliders until I finally get the color I want. Sure, with more experience I would get faster at this, but why make it so difficult in the first place? With that being said, I still recommend having at least a rough idea of how to navigate through RGB for 3 reasons. Firstly, there are lots of tools that rely on the red, green and blue channels. For example, the tone curves. It lets you change all 3 RGB values at once, making the image brighter and darker and changing its contrast. And it also lets you change the curves for each channel individually. This enables me to easily add more blue to the darker colors, like the shadows, while increasing red and green for the brighter colors to make them warmer looking and perhaps reduce the amount of blue. I also like using this in combination with blending modes, like brightness, to fine adjust the contrasts without getting crazy amounts of saturation. I already have some tone curve settings for this artwork back then when I worked on it. Or perhaps you could use the color balance. Or level correction. I'm not going to explain how all of these and other tools work, but let me tell you, they are super useful. Because it is quite difficult to pick out the perfect colors for the artwork right from the get-go. Doing some fine adjustments at the end can make a huge difference and make your colors much more balanced and pleasing looking. The second reason for learning RGB is because sometimes you don't have a choice. It can happen that some kind of software you're using only gives you RGB sliders to pick out your colors. I have seen this sometimes in video games, for example. So at least you can be somewhat prepared, instead of blindly stumbling around until you finally find the color that you want. And then the third reason would be because understanding RGB will help you understand other color spaces like HSL and HSV a lot better. And blending modes too. Pretty much everything in your graphics program is based on RGB in some shape or form after all. By the way, I'm also working on a video series about those blending modes where you will be able to see those effects very clearly. Like for example, that the multiply blending mode doesn't just make colors darker. The RGB values play an important role too, and you can get some crazy unexpected results if you are not careful. Alright, that was quite a lot about RGB alone. It is time to finally talk about some of the other color spaces. Next up is HSV and HSL. Those letters stand for hue, saturation and value, or lightness. Instead of HSV, you could also have HSB, so brightness instead of value. It means the exact same thing in this case though. Or the L in HSL could mean luminosity, and some programs, for some reason, write it as HLS. Because why not make it more confusing for people? So when you would visualize the RGB color space, you usually do so with a cube. We got red, green and blue on the 3 corners, magenta, yellow and cyan on 3 others since they have 2 RGB values at maximum, and black and white for all values at 0 and 100%. All the other colors are on and inside this cube. HSV and HSL transform that cube into a cylinder. Look at these 2 animations that nicely show how it is done. The 6 colored corners warp into a circle and the black and white corners get expanded to create a cylinder shape. Or just the black corner in the case of HSV, while the coloring gets raised up to the top. On the RGB cube you would move in 3 straight directions to navigate and find the colors you want. But here in this case, one of the parameters is actually an angle, the hue. You rotate in 360 degrees to choose the hue. And the other 2 parameters let you move around on a slice, from the middle to the outer edge at the chosen angle. Now what do these parameters even mean? Red, green and blue are pretty straightforward to understand, but what is meant with hue, saturation and lightness or value? Let me explain the hue at first. This one has a lot to do with RGB. This is a hue ring, and all of the colors on it are the hue colors. It starts at red, goes through all the colors, and ends at red again. Now let me switch to the RGB color space. As you can see, the hue colors perfectly follow the edges of the outer corners. There are basically 2 rules to this. One RGB value is always at 0 and one is always at maximum. Let's start from red again. You can see through the hex code that the red has FF, so it's maxed out, while the others are at 0. See this as a little practice for reading hex codes too. Now changing the hue to orange, you can see that the 2 digits for green are increasing while red stays at max. And then when both are at maximum, we have yellow right at this corner here. To move further, we decrease the red value now until only green is left. And you do the same as you move in the blue direction, and from blue back to red. By the way, notice that the in-between colors, the secondary colors as they are often called, look brighter than the individual RGB colors they consist of. That's simply because there is just overall more light shining. Like for example, you have the red lights in your device shining at maximum already, and then you also let green fully shine to create yellow. That's a lot more light intensity in total. Alright, now what does saturation mean? Basically it defines how much color of the chosen hue color you get. If you got 0, then you just have gray. Which gray in particular depends on which of the 2 systems you use, and that's one of the main differences between the 2. Let's take HSV at first and look at the hue color. When you lower the saturation from this point, you move to the left and get a pastel color at first, and then pure white. Whereas in the HSL system you move towards 50% gray. Again, it's called HLS here, but it's the same. Therefore, the value in HSV and lightness in HSL are different too. The terms value or brightness can be a bit misleading. It's better to think of it more so as the absence of black. The lower the value, the more black you add to the color. That's why if you got 100% value, you don't necessarily have white, even though white is the brightest color of all. But when you have 0% value, you always have black, regardless of what hue or saturation you pick. As for the lightness in HSL, think of it in 2 parts. The more you lower the lightness, the more you move towards black. But also the more you increase the lightness, the more you move towards white. Therefore 100% lightness always gives you white and nothing else. This might be perhaps a bit more intuitive to understand, because the lightness always gives you the full spectrum between white and black for any given saturation and hue. So then, would I recommend HSL over HSV? Well, not necessarily. I personally use HSV. Why? Because I'm simply just more used to it. Both of these systems are so similar to each other that it doesn't really matter all that much which one you use. One of the downsides of HSL is that in this square there's less overall color information going on, because not only is black spread across the entire bottom, but also white covers the entire top. If you're close to either of these and move a bit to the left or right, you will barely notice any change. That is why HSL often is actually shown as a triangular color picker. You simply collapse white and black into mere corners. So the transformation from before simply stops after rounding the RGB cube, giving you a double cone. And the two-dimensional slice from the middle to the outer corner gives you a triangle. So there you go. Now we don't have so much space wasted on our color picker, although you might argue that you have too little control close to the white and black points now. Moving just a tiny bit can decide between very low and very high saturation now. And there is another thing that might cause some confusion. On the square shape, it is very clear that if you move horizontally, you change the saturation, and vertically you change the lightness. In the case of the triangle shape, moving horizontally still only changes the saturation, but the lightness moves along diagonals that connect the middle with the white and black corners. If you start from the hue color, you move along the outer edge. Lower the saturation, and now you move along these lines that are directed at either the white or black corner, depending on if you are above or below 50% lightness. And the angle between those two gets flatter and flatter until you have the grayscale, letting you move straight up and down again. This is a lot more confusing if you want to use this color picker to change only the lightness of your color. It's hard to know in which direction exactly you need to move. Whereas on the square format, it is a lot more straightforward, literally even. By the way, the triangle format is not limited to HSL. HSV can also be expressed that way. Krita, for example, gives you that option. At this angle for the triangle, the saturation once again moves horizontally. But the value moves on diagonals that always align with the black corner. So basically it's the same problem, but at least the path for the value doesn't change midway through like the lightness in HSL. Now this sounds a lot like I might recommend HSV overall more, together with the square format. Well, those flaws don't really matter all that much overall. That's because if you're using those color pickers and you might be a bit more advanced, you're not thinking of the exact values you're picking, but more so the relative position on those shapes. Like for example, I know that the pastel colors are concentrated in the upper left corner in the square-shaped HSV color picker that I use. Or that I get my neutrals on the far left side. And perhaps I want to create some kind of color palette. Then I tend to think in curves from the point I start from. If I curve to the right, my darker colors are gonna be more vibrant. And I could be moving in straight lines or curves with all sorts of curvatures, and all of those paths give me slightly different gradients. Usually I also shift the hue, like for example towards blue for darker colors. You would do the same thing in the triangular HSL color picker. You know where specific types of colors are and what directions you need to move to create certain color combinations. Through experimentation and practice, you will get used to it and master whatever color picker you choose. The reason why I personally use HSV is just simply because it's the first standard color picker in the graphics programs that I started using many years ago, and I just stuck with it. I'm not used to HSL, so I struggle with it a little, but if you are more used to HSL, then you'd probably struggle with HSV. So my recommendation for you, if you're a complete beginner, is to just try out both. See which one is more intuitive for you and just stick with it. Well, it could happen that you might want or need to get accustomed to some other software, but that one only uses the color picker you're not used to. That would be unfortunate. However, again, those two are very similar to each other, so I don't think it would take you all that long to get used to the other. Perhaps you could even get used to both at the same time. By the way, there are also circular color pickers. Those I would not recommend. Like in Procreate. Seriously, why is that the default? Where exactly is the spot for perfect white? In what direction does the saturation change? Well, at least they still offer other, normal color pickers. Then you could also have the hue on your two-dimensional surface mapped out. Set the slider to be the saturation so that moving left and right on the square changes the hue, and vertically you change the lightness. Or you put the value or lightness on the slider so that you have the saturation along the vertical axis. I would not really recommend those versions though. In my opinion, this makes it harder to efficiently navigate. But sometimes the software you use doesn't give you any other choice. Yes, I'm looking at you, Microsoft Paint. Get out of here, you're just a meme. Now, let me point out something else that is quite important. The hue colors do not have the same perceptual lightness. With that I mean that the different hue colors do not look equally bright to our human eyes. This yellow, for example, is clearly much brighter than blue, red is darker than green, and so on. The value in HSV or the lightness in HSL do not account for that. They just take a hue color and move from there. So when you're on some point in the middle of your color picker and then change your hue, still remaining on the same spot on the surface, the perceptual lightness might be way off. Like this dark magenta is clearly darker than the turquoise. If it had the same perceptual lightness, then the border between the colors would get quite blurry to our eyes. By the way, I would highly recommend to always check how the colors look directly next to each other. Your eyes are still the best guide, and no color picker can fully replace this method. Also because your brain perceives colors differently depending on the surrounding colors. That's a whole topic in itself though. And so another thing, if you want to create a grayscale image, do not just reduce the saturation to 0. Otherwise you're going to completely ruin your contrasts that way. For example, the flowers in this artwork get a whole lot brighter all of a sudden. Or let's take a look at this gradient of all the hue colors. When I reduce the saturation to 0, then we only got the same 50% gray left. You're not able to distinguish the stripes from before at all. So instead, convert to grayscale. Or use a gradient map adjustment layer with 0% smoothness. Or a white fill layer set to the color blending mode. Photoshop also has a black and white adjustment layer. Just to quickly give you some alternative methods. Creating a grayscale version can be a bit of a complicated topic. Different balances are appropriate for different situations. But I can tell you that just reducing the saturation to 0 is generally not a good way. Perhaps I will make a tutorial about grayscale conversion someday. We'll see. Now, the following color spaces that I want to introduce are probably unfamiliar to you, but are super interesting. So next up is the CIELAB color space, an HCL which is based on CIELAB. Looks a whole lot weirder and complicated than the RGB cube, or the HSV and HSL cylinders. If you take a look in the color settings by double-clicking on your primary or secondary color in your graphics program, like Photoshop for example, you'll see a bunch of parameters. Here we got HSB, we got RGB, even CMYK is here. And there's LAB. You might have actually seen those letters in some color settings before, but had no idea what they do, so you just ignore them. These three represent the CIELAB color space. A and B together represent the chromaticity of specific colors. Those are kind of difficult to understand and not really useful for navigating. So I would only select the L parameter for the slider. Here you can remember that the further away you are from the middle, where A and B are 0, the more vibrant the colors are. Now here L stands for lightness again, but in this case it's the perceptual lightness. How bright or dark these colors actually appear to our eyes. When I change the L value, then all the colors in our square have about the same perceptual lightness. And so if I put those colors next to each other on my canvas, the borders between them will get very blurry. This color picker is not perfect, I do have to say though. And especially this color picker in Photoshop is not perfect. For example, it doesn't make any sense that there are other colors than white and black for the values 100 and 0. Let's take a look at the 3D model again. Don't mind the label for the vertical axis, it should say L and go until 100, seems to be a little mistake by the author. So these colors are the outermost RGB colors, the surface of the RGB cube. For our digital devices that work with sRGB, we shouldn't be able to pick colors that are outside of the shape. Look at the bottom for example, the range in which we still have possible A and B values is very small and shrinks to 0 at the lightness being equal to 0. However, in Photoshop it still shows us the whole range between -128 and 127, which just doesn't make any sense at all. A little thing I can do is pick out some colors from this HSV color picker in the background and watch how the cursor in the CIELAB color picker moves. As you can see, it never touches the outermost edge of the square. Instead, it stays within the three-dimensional shape that I showed you before. This makes it even clearer that a lot of the colors in the CIELAB color picker of Photoshop just don't make any sense. A very poor implementation, unfortunately. Such a shame, since CIELAB can be a really useful color space to use. For example, you want to have colored text on a colored background. You want to make sure that there is enough contrast, otherwise it will be difficult to read. Using the lightness of the HSL color space, for example, would not be very consistent. I choose this dark blue-green as background with about 25% lightness. Now I put text with a blue hue over it and increase the lightness to a strong 65%. A 40% difference should be enough, right? Well, as you can see, it is not. It's barely distinguishable. However, using a specific difference in lightness for the CIELAB color space is much more accurate. I can see now that the background color had a perceptual lightness of about 46%. Gonna increase it again by 40% using a blue color, and there you go, a huge difference. This is quite useful for algorithms, for example. Computers don't see colors through our eyes. They need a mathematical structure to tell how large the contrast is. And for something like that, CIELAB is quite well suited. Now the A and B parameters make navigating through this color space quite inconvenient. And so let me introduce HCL. So this one derived from the CIELAB color space. The letters stand for hue, chroma and lightness or luminance. The hue is roughly the same as before in HSV and HSL, and the lightness is the same as in CIELAB. The chroma is sort of similar to saturation, but it more so describes the vividness of a color. Like for example, if you have red, then the hue color of red would be the most vivid, it pops the most. While pink or dark red, while also having full saturation in the HSL color space, do not appear as strongly colorful. GIMP actually gives you a color picker based on the HCL color space. Well, they call it LCH, again with the letter juggling, so confusing. Unlike Photoshop, they do a much better job at implementing this perceptual lightness color space because they actually show you which colors are within the RGB range. It can look quite wild and perplexing, however, and so much magenta. For all three parameters you see these weird looking cutout shapes. They look so crazy because this color space is not a neat and simple shape like a cube, a cylinder or a cone. It is far more complex. You slice through the shape just like you did in HSV and HSL, but because of the irregular shape you don't get slices that neatly fit into a square. So the magenta areas represent areas that are outside of the three-dimensional shape and therefore are impossible. They don't exist within the RGB space, or don't exist at all. Look at the RGB values, they go above 100%. Or even below 0%. It doesn't make any logical sense. It's just error. Let's call them error colors. Alright, we're gonna take a look at the L parameter first. So all the colors for any particular amount of L look about equally bright to our human eyes. We have the hue on the horizontal axis and the chroma on the vertical one. At 0 and 100%, it always collapses into flat lines at the bottom. Which makes sense, because for both there is only one value for each, white and black. The chroma of those two is always 0. There is no color vividness in black or white. Let's take a look at 25, 50 and 75%. At 75%, the color that would have the strongest chroma is this green. Compared to the pink here, it is much more vibrant. For this particular lightness, however, there is no red that has more chroma than that. The hue color red is quite dark after all. And you can see at 50% that red is peaking, together with purple. While 25% gives us a large peak at blue. Blue, after all, is the darkest hue color. Now let's change to the chroma parameter. This time the vertical axis is the lightness. All the colors in our square have the same vividness now. No chroma gives us a grayscale gradient. Makes sense. Okay, now it's gonna get weird. See that the chroma doesn't stop at 100, it just keeps on going. Increase it further and there will be only blue left. The pure blue from the RGB colors has the highest chroma of all. But beyond 131, there are no colors left anymore. Theoretically, the chroma has no maximum. But we are limited to, first of all, what colors our human eyes can actually see, and what colors our digital devices can show, which are restricted to RGB after all. Therefore, at some point we just stop seeing more colors here. But yeah, in general, the higher the chroma setting, the less colors there are that can reach that amount of chroma. That's why these areas are shrinking as you increase it. Last but definitely not least, the hue. This might be the most practical color picker version of all three. You have the lightness on the vertical axis and the chroma on the horizontal. The weird corner shape changes as you change the hue. For bright hue colors, the right corner moves upwards, and for very dark ones, it drops closer to the bottom. After all, we learned earlier that the hue colors do not have the same perceptual lightness. Also, the tip of the corner is always the hue color. No other colors have more chroma than those. They are always the most vivid colors. So how could you use this as a color picker? Well, let's create a color palette. Gonna start with a random color. How about the cyan? If I shift the hue, the new color will have very little contrast to the first color, as long as it is still within the possible range. None of those two colors are particularly more dominant in terms of vibrancy or lightness. But by moving that cursor, you can precisely control what contrasts you get. How about a darker purple that is more neutral? So we gotta move down and to the left. I haven't even painted the purple yet, but I already know that the color will be darker and less vibrant. There we go, I can add this to the palette. I didn't change the chroma too drastically, so it harmonizes with the other colors still well enough. Let me demonstrate what happens if I do make a huge jump in chroma. I pick out an even darker color, let's make it blue, and I move far to the right. Okay, how does it look like next to the others? Oh no. Let me move back to the left again. Much better. This palette is a bit too tame though, nothing pops out at all. So let's take a brighter color with a bit more chroma. Not too much though. Like this yellow for example. Yeah, this can work. And based on those kind of movements, you can pick out your colors and it's much easier to find ones that go well with the already existing colors. This is a color picker that I personally wish would be in a lot more other graphics programs. Yes, it's very confusing for people that are not familiar with it. Definitely not the most beginner-friendly color space. But I think it can be really powerful for artists, designers and other people who have to create color combinations. However, out of all the graphics programs that I tested, which are Photoshop, Clip Studio Paint, Krita and GIMP, only GIMP had it built in. A bit of a bummer, but oh well. There is also the case again that if you primarily use HCL, which is quite rare in graphics programs, then you might struggle when you have to use some software that doesn't have it. So would I recommend it? If it is available to you, perhaps not as your main color picker, but as a side assistant, absolutely. GIMP is open source and completely free, so you could still get it and use it for making palettes perhaps. Just a little idea. Even CIELAB can have its uses. Sometimes I check the L value of certain colors if I'm not so sure how they would contrast with other colors. As a color picker, it's not particularly useful though, especially since the A and B parameters are so unintuitive. HCL, however, makes a lot more sense. So yeah, if you got access to it, try to get familiar with it. You don't need to use it all the time, but in some situations it's a good tool to have in your repertoire. Okay, the next one is CMYK. This one is only relevant if you want to print something out. In that case, however, it can be super important to be aware of how it works, and there is a lot to consider. If you're not careful, your colors might get messed up and look completely different on your printout compared to how they look like on your computer screen. First off, the basics though. So CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, which is black. Yep, this color space actually has 4 parameters this time. How come? Well, you need to understand that CMYK is designed for mixing pigments on a white surface. It's the opposite from the color mixing method of RGB, which uses light. And you usually see those two diagrams to compare additive and subtractive color mixing. The additive version is correct, that is how RGB works. But the CMYK diagram is not accurate. This indicates that it is the exact opposite of RGB, but that is not the case. First of all, it is impossible to create a true black for mixing cyan, magenta and yellow, or whatever other primary colors you would choose. The result is more so of a muddy looking dark color and not a true black. Therefore, black ink is added in addition as the key color. The reason why the 3 primary colors are not enough has to do with how colored surfaces absorb and reflect light, which is determined by their chemical compositions. A bit more of a complicated topic and not that relevant here, so I won't explain it right now, but I might do so in another video. Alright, now let's do the same thing we did previously with this nifty piece of software. Gonna plot the CMYK gamut on this diagram from before that shows us the visible light spectrum and all the colors in between. And I choose this particular CMYK color profile, which is one of the US standards. I'll talk about the different profiles soon. You can see that the borders look very wobbly, and also it covers a rather small area of the whole diagram. Let's compare it with the sRGB color space. You can clearly see that this CMYK profile is a whole lot smaller, especially in the blue area. Actually, let me make it even clearer how much smaller it is by switching to a 3D mode here. Yep, this free program is quite neat, even though it's a bit old. Okay, now what is this? Well, the solid shape in the middle represents the CMYK gamut we chose, and the wireframe around it is the sRGB gamut. And we're actually using the CIELAB color space to map these colors out. So on the vertical axis we got the perceptual lightness, and across the horizontal A and B plane we have all the different colors. And again, the further a color is from the vertical middle line, the higher the chromaticity, so the vibrancy of the color. You don't have to be an expert to see that they have very different sizes. Look at the bottom, it especially lags in terms of dark colors. In the lower right corner you can see their total volume. So sRGB is more than twice as large, although those numbers don't exactly stand for the actual amount of colors. Now, what does this all mean? Well, the thing is that you cannot get colors printed out that are outside of the CMYK shape. But there are RGB colors outside of the range of CMYK colors that are still possible. So it can happen that you have an image on your computer that looks very vibrant, but then ends up real dull looking when printed out. Let me actually demonstrate this. Here I have a color sheet with the primary and secondary RGB colors, some brighter and darker highly saturated colors, and these hue gradients with full saturation, half saturation, and half brightness and saturation. Let me convert it into CMYK now here in Photoshop. In this case I have Euroscale coated V2 selected as profile, just to have something selected. And as you can see, the colors have changed, some of them even quite drastically. Especially the highly saturated colors get a lot less vivid, a lot muddier, they don't pop as much anymore. By the way, you don't have to convert the entire project to see these colors. You can also go to View and click on Proof Colors to see how it would look like in CMYK. Some other programs have preview functions like this one too. You can also use the keyboard shortcut to quickly switch back and forth. Here I have a sheet that puts all of those colors directly next to each other to make the differences even clearer. The darker colors down here have been doing fine, but almost all of the others, not so much. Some of them didn't just get shifted in terms of saturation, but also their brightness is quite different. So not only could this mess up the vibrancy of your colors, but also your contrasts. Looking down here at the gradients, we can see a clear cut between the original RGB colors and the CMYK colors. However, the difference for the less saturated one is not that extreme, and for the last gradient it is barely noticeable. Let me demonstrate how much those CMYK profiles can vary though. I'm gonna really stretch out the color picker in Photoshop to make it super clear. Then I click up here to change the colors to the CMYK color spectrum. Already quite a shift. Now I go to Edit and Color Settings. Here you can change the color profiles for RGB, CMYK, and do some other stuff that's not that relevant right now. It does give you a description of the currently selected color space when you hover over it, which is nice. And here we have a bunch of different CMYK profiles. They are standards from various regions around the world, like for the US, Europe, Japan, and so on. I'm just gonna select the first one and scroll down and up with the mouse wheel. Oh wow, the colors are changing quite dramatically. So you see, it also depends on what profile you're choosing. But which one is it now that you need? I wish I could give you a clear answer, but there isn't one. You need to look at your printer's manual, or ask your printing service, or experiment around by printing out test versions in different profiles. And experimentation might be necessary, because another thing to keep in mind is that these CMYK colors are not 100% accurately shown on your screen. They will most likely still look different on your printouts, but it's still a whole lot closer than if you just use RGB colors. Now let's talk about CMYK as a color picker. The thing is, CMYK has 4 variables, so 4 dimensions. It can actually not be shown with a square and a slider like the others, because those only show 3 dimensions, 2 for the square and 1 for the slider. So you usually only have the 4 sliders that let you change the cyan, magenta, yellow and black content. Any color picked this way should be relatively safe to use for printing. No guarantees, however. Photoshop gives you a gamut warning if the color you picked is outside of the one for printing. When I pick colors using RGB, I might get that warning. But when I use the CMYK sliders, I don't get it at all. Okay, but how do you work with this? How can you tell what CMYK values you need to get specific colors? Well, sort of similarly to how you mix colors on your painter's palette to create new ones. Different to the RGB sliders before, you now make the colors darker the more color you use. If you mix all of them together in equal amounts, you get sort of a warm looking gray, not an actual pure gray though. Now when I pick a gray color, you can see that the balance between the individual colors is not equal. There's more cyan, and magenta and yellow are unbalanced too. If I want a warmer color, I mix in more yellow and perhaps some magenta. I can use the K slider to easily get a darker or lighter version of the current color. The fact that the colors of the sliders change too helps a lot. I'm admittedly not very familiar with these sliders, so I can't give you a whole lot of advice. In general, I don't have that much experience with mixing pigments. I'm primarily a digital artist, and my traditional art is mostly pencil drawings. However, if you're mainly a traditional artist and already have a lot of experience with this type of process, then the CMYK color sliders might actually be more intuitive for you than other color pickers. And again, they do have the advantage of giving you colors that are more safe for printing. So this program doesn't give me a warning like Photoshop did, but I can sort of tell when I'm moving out of the CMYK range, and that is if one of the sliders hit 100% or 0% and I still keep on moving. Like for example when I move towards the hue color, those are always impossible to achieve. When I try to reach the upper corner by changing the sliders, I can't quite do it, no matter what values I use. By the way, if I just quickly click on one of the CMYK sliders, it will snap back to a color within its gamut. Now some programs are able to switch to a CMYK mode, so that the color pickers also only show CMYK colors. Krita for example has that option. You click on the little icon in the upper left corner of the color picker, and right here you can set it up so that the color selector uses a different color space than in the image. Set the model to CMYK, if it isn't already, and choose your profile. You can also import profiles if needed. And those profiles are freely available for download on the internet. Adobe for example offers some. Look up ICC profiles. So click OK, and the color picker has changed significantly now. Gonna pick out blue since that one has the strongest difference. And you can see that even the most vibrant blue here is quite dulled down. If you turn the option from before off again, therefore going back to RGB, you can see where that color actually would have been. Quite a jump. Unfortunately, not all programs offer something like this though. I think it can be very useful if you work with prints a lot. Okay, I already have been talking quite a lot about CMYK, so let me summarize. Be aware of potentially unwanted color conversions when you want to print out your images. Convert your images to CMYK before the printing to have at least a rough idea of how the colors are going to get changed. And I would only recommend using CMYK sliders for picking out your colors if you are already used to color mixing in a similar way as a traditional artist or printer. Otherwise, I wouldn't say that it is particularly intuitive. And the lack of two-dimensional color squares to navigate around makes them even more inconvenient. However, switching your color picker of choice to CMYK, if possible, can be quite useful. Lastly, I want to talk about Pantones, another color system used for printing. However, unlike CMYK, this one actually is internationally universal. That is the entire point of Pantones, to recreate the exact same colors everywhere on this world. So that if you see a color in Austria, for example, and want to communicate to someone in Singapore what color you're seeing, then Pantones make that possible. They are created by the Pantone LLC company, located in the US, and are specialized in analyzing and recreating colors. The Pan prefix in the word Pantone is Greek and means all. However, this can be a bit misleading. It doesn't have all the tones and colors, it's more about color consistency. As I'm writing this, there are over 1,800 Pantone colors. This number keeps on increasing though. That amount of colors compared to the millions of RGB colors, for example, is very little. You also have a much wider range with CMYK. The whole process is more complicated and they have to ensure that they retain consistency while also considering printing constraints. And there are also economical reasons. More colors would increase costs and complexity. Not every graphics program has Pantone color pickers and sets built in. Even Photoshop has them kind of hidden in the color settings. You have to click on color libraries. And then there are tons of books to choose from for all sorts of different printing purposes. Now it is impossible to have an accurate Pantone color picker built into your graphics program. The restrictions of your computer still apply. The colors shown on your screen are still displayed via RGB colors, and it will look different from display to display. It can be helpful though to get at least somewhat close to the available Pantone colors. If you really want as much accuracy as possible, you would have to buy color books from the company and compare those colors with those on your screen and prints. Or use expensive tools for directly scanning and analyzing colors. It's only useful if you work in the industry, like in a multinational company that tries to make its products look consistent everywhere around the world. Otherwise, you really don't need to worry about Pantones. Why did I include them here in this video then? Because I do notice that they get mentioned a good amount of time and I wanted to clear things up a little. That's all. Alright, those were the main color spaces that I wanted to talk about. There are lots and lots of others, but those that I mentioned are the most common ones in popular graphics programs. As to which color space and picker I would recommend the most, there is no clear winner. Sorry if that's what you're expecting. They all have their different purposes, and my recommendation would be to try out those that suit your purposes and use the one that works best for you personally. My aim was to give you an overview of what's available and teach you the basic principles of how they all work. This video has gotten quite massive, but I just barely scratched the surface of this topic. It's a whole scientific field. It's not as trivial as you might think to make the colors on your screen, software and prints the way they are. I myself am not an expert. I'm just an artist with a background and fascination in science. Feel free to post your questions down below, but know that I might not be the biggest of help. However, I always appreciate constructive feedback. And if you do know more about this stuff and want to add or correct some important things, then that would be great. Alright then, thank you a lot for watching, and see you next time.